All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty dramatic cultural timeline. We're talking about how Canada's major arts institutions went from this booming, flush with cash golden era right to the absolute brink of financial collapse. And, crucially, we're going to break down the precise 2001 emergency survival plan that was drawn up to stop them from just disappearing altogether.
It's actually wild to think about. How do these massive cultural pillars, the big symphonies, the ballet companies, the historic theaters, how do they end up starving for cash and literally fighting for survival by the late 90s? These are places that employ thousands of people, they anchor Canadian culture, they even bear the names of their cities and provinces, yet they were quietly suffocating. So, how does that happen?
To figure this out, we're going to treat this like a medical diagnosis. First, we'll look at the centennial arts boom, then the catch-22 of growth. After that, the anatomy of a crisis, followed by changing Canadian audiences, and finally, the arts survival plan.
First up, the centennial arts boom, a golden era of creation.
Let's establish our baseline of health by traveling back to 1967. The sheer volume of artistic output from this era was just staggering. Take this Music Canada catalog from December '67. It perfectly captures what people were calling the Centennial Storm. The editor's note explicitly points out this absolute barrage of new Canadian arts and concert music being commissioned. Institutions actually had the financial backing to be bold, to really test the waters with wildly adventurous new repertoire.
And the ambition was off the charts. I mean, massive projects like Harry Sommer's three-act bilingual opera Louis Riel were being commissioned just for 1967. We're talking a cast of 37 and a full orchestra. It really proves the immense cultural footprint and the robust early financial backing of what would eventually become Canada's large performing arts organizations. They were literally building a legacy.
Moving to part two, the catch-22 of growth, when expansion leads to starvation.
Now here is where it gets super interesting. The very success and explosion of artistic activity in Canada directly caused the financial starvation of these historical institutions, the ones known in our sources as the Big 29. Look at how crazy the competition got. In the 1950s, you only had 27 professional performing arts organizations in Canada. Fast forward to the year 2000, the Canada Council was suddenly funding 860 organizations. So those big, pioneering organizations now had to share stagnant public grants with a massively expanded pool. The pie itself didn't grow, but the number of slices skyrocketed.
So the crucial point here is this catch-22, which is exactly what a 2001 working group report called it. On one hand, government funders were demanding these large companies do adventurous programming, feature more Canadian content, reach out to new demographics. But on the other hand, the proportional funding that actually makes that kind of creative risk possible, it was steadily getting slashed. Basically, they were being asked to do way more with way less.
Section 3. Anatomy of a Crisis, Diagnosing the Financial Collapse.
Let's dig into the hard data to see how this underfunding completely paralyzed the arts sector by 2001. We are looking at a catastrophic 30-year drop in proportional public funding here. Back in the 1968-69 season, the Canada Council provided over 23% of the average budget for these large companies. But by 1998, that contribution plummeted to a mere 8.4%. It fell to barely a third of its original value. This forced these groups to rely heavily on private donations and box office sales just to keep the lights on.
And the result of that massive drop, by the 1998-99 season, the accumulated deficit of those big 29 companies hit $20 million. Think about that for a second. That is an enormous financial crater, leaving these supposedly rock-solid cultural pillars incredibly fragile and vulnerable to, well, even the slightest economic hiccup.
Which brings us to a severe institutional symptom called undercapitalization. In plain terms, this means these organizations totally lacked working capital reserves. They had no financial cushion to weather a bad season or try something new. And what's really wild is that if they actually did manage to save a little money and carry a surplus, funders often penalize them with grant reductions. It's crazy. They were essentially locked into a state of constant, stressful, day-to-day crisis management.
We really have to ask ourselves, how do you cut costs when your product is a 60-piece orchestra? You see, these large-scale groups have incredibly high fixed costs. You literally cannot perform a major symphony by scaling back your 60-piece orchestra to 30 pieces without totally breaking your fundamental promise of artistic quality to the community. So their options for cost-cutting? Practically non-existent.
Part 4. Changing Canadian Audiences, a Shifting Environment.
Because listen,
While the funding was drying up and costs stayed fixed, the very ground these organizations stood on was shifting drastically. Demographics were changing fast. The organizations built on traditional European arts, like classical ballet or symphony, grew up during a time when the Canadian population was literally doubling. But by the 2000s, they were navigating a much slower growing population, only about 1% a year, and with entirely new cultural backgrounds arriving through global immigration. Their traditional core audience base was simply shrinking.
Add to that an explosive rise in competition for our free time. The late 90s and early 2000s saw the boom of massive commercial mega musicals, blockbusters, cheap CDs, DVDs, and of course the early internet. These things fiercely competed for the exact same disposable income that used to go to live theater. Plus, audiences started demanding modern, highly upgraded venues, and the aging 1967 Centennial infrastructure just couldn't keep up.
Which finally brings us to Section 5. The Arts Survival Plan, the 2001 prescription.
So, with the crisis fully diagnosed, shrinking funds, changing audiences, those massive deficits, a working group in 2001 had to formulate a precise, urgent survival plan to keep these institutions alive. And their prescription was highly structured and aggressive. First, inject at least $10 million in stable, multi-year funding, up to 5-year grants so companies could actually plan for the future. Second, critically, remove that penalty for saving money. Allow companies to build up to 25% in working capital reserves without losing their grants. And third, coordinate federal tax incentives with provincial funding to really incentivize and drive private donations.
The report also demanded a completely new approach to funding called holistic peer assessment. Basically, it argued that you just cannot separate an organization's artistic vitality from its financial stability or its relevance to the community. They're all part of the same interconnected ecosystem. If you have a sick balance sheet, you're inevitably going to get safe, stagnant, boring art.
So that 2001 roadmap was drawn to save Canada's large performing arts, shifting the whole mindset from panicked year-to-year survival over to long-term sustainability. But it definitely leaves us with a compelling final thought. As our cultural and economic landscapes continue to evolve today, can structural remedies like these truly secure the future of traditional arts? Or are we just witnessing the slow, inevitable fade of a golden era? Something to think about next time you take a seat in a historic concert hall.